Hello, and welcome to this short conversation on vaccines and COVID-19. My name is Karen Bantel, and I'm a volunteer with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Michigan. Previously, I was a professor of business strategy and entrepreneurship and a consultant in technology commercialization at the university. I would like to welcome today David Hutton, who is an associate professor in health management and policy and global public health at the University of Michigan. Thank you, David, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you. So we have a few questions about vaccines and COVID-19. And the first is, David, we wanted to ask you about some of the unique challenges that we are faced with in the process of developing a vaccine for COVID-19. What are you and other public health experts concerned about and thinking about during this process?
Any vaccine development has a lot of risk and uncertainty associated with it. And typically in the drug and device development process, you have many phases of clinical trials. There's a lot of work even pre-clinical trials that's done, but you have phases of clinical trials. And typically in those clinical trials, only maybe 1 out of 10 drugs that start at the beginning of clinical trials actually make it to an FDA-approved drug. And I would think that we probably are facing the similar, risks and probabilities with coronavirus vaccines. And so, we have about 8 vaccine candidates in trials today, and there's a lot of uncertainty about whether any of them will make it out the other end of the pipeline. There are some encouraging steps we're seeing in kind of the phases of the trials, but there are 3 phases of trials, and really we're kind of most of them are in phases 1 and 2. So it's uncertain whether or not we'll see any of these current ones actually make it out the other end of the pipeline. That's a process that's fraught with risk. And the second thing that I'd be concerned about, or we should all be thinking about, is the actual manufacturing, production, and distribution of vaccines to the population. That's usually a process that takes a long time as well. And we've got billions of people on the planet who want this vaccine. And so there are going to be a lot of challenges developing and producing enough vaccine for everyone who's going to want it.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you, David. And one of the issues that we're faced with, of course, is trying to do this within a very short time frame. This administration has talked about having a vaccine by the end of this calendar year. Other experts are saying 2 years is a minimum and maybe beyond that. Can you make a comment about the risks that you see of maybe trying to accelerate a development process like this, and any other thoughts you have about that time frame?
Sure, and I'll say, typically, a lot of vaccines that have been produced in the last, new vaccines in the last 10 years, they might take, a decade or more to go through the research and development and manufacturing and production process. So 2 years it would certainly be very accelerated. The only vaccines we see that are of that same time scale are flu vaccines, but those are not necessarily really new vaccines. It's just changing a few things for whatever the latest strains are that are circulating this year. The coronavirus vaccine is a new vaccine, and so we would expect it to take a while. There are a lot of steps that are being accelerated and planned to be accelerated in this process to hopefully get a vaccine out in 1 to 2 years. That is very challenging to do that. There are several things that we can do to try to accelerate that. We can try to speed up the process of doing the clinical trials, and we can also try to speed up the process of delivering those vaccines to market. But there are a lot of challenges with that. It's going to be very costly to do both of those things. But I think there are a lot of people willing to make those big investments to make those speed up. But there could be some challenges with knowing that this is going to be as safe and effective as we would like to. Whenever you kind of accelerate these clinical trials, there is potentially a risk of you being less certain in the efficacy and safety of these vaccines. So that certainly is a concern. Also, when you accelerate the manufacturing and production process too, we clearly want this vaccine out as soon as possible, but there also could be risks of missteps in the process that could make the vaccine less safe. I think there are a lot of people thinking about those safety issues and effectiveness issues, but those certainly are always risks.
Okay, terrific. So, David, could you talk a bit about how the U.S. has, traditionally has essentially a for-profit model, economic model for vaccine development, and how that it might be impacting the attempt to find a vaccine this time? Are there kind of the trade-offs in terms of is it a positive or negative in terms of rapid deployment of a vaccine?
Well, we certainly have a big need for a vaccine. And it's encouraging to see that there are a lot of private organizations, drug companies, vaccine companies working on this project to develop a vaccine. And it's encouraging to see those companies from the US, Asia, Europe, all around the world trying to develop a vaccine. I mean, in my view, kind of the profit motive is certainly strong and encouraging these companies to produce the vaccines. There will be some challenges though, and once, I mean, if and when a vaccine becomes available, those companies are going to want to see a reward for the vaccine that they've produced, and that could be challenging. You know, by when I say they want to see a reward, that might mean a very high price for the vaccine, and so that could be challenging, right? Because the higher the price, maybe there would be less access for the vaccine for a lot of people. There also might be a lot of pressure for governments to um, you know, take that vaccine from the manufacturers and try to deliver it to masses. And in many ways, that's a good thing because they would be expanding and giving access to this vaccine so more and more people could get it. But on the flip side, if you're a company thinking about investing billions of dollars in developing a vaccine, you might think twice about that if you were worried that various governments around the world were just going to take your patent away from you and take away that big pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
Great. Could you just speculate for us, David, about some of the public health policy implications of vaccine development? Where do you think we need to be going in regard to getting a vaccine to the public?
I mean, there are a lot of things. I guess when you say we, I mean one of the things we can think about is what the federal government could do to accelerate vaccine development, and I think they're trying to do some things to accelerate vaccine development. And I guess there are two parts of that too. Is one is the research side of it to develop a vaccine that would be FDA approved, and the other is actually commercializing and developing the vaccine. And I think um, governments can provide financial incentive to these private um, vaccine manufacturers and developers to develop a vaccine, maybe give them a prize, a very lucrative prize to develop a vaccine that meets certain efficacy and safety standards. I know also they're working on providing incentives for vaccine manufacturing. That's something that I know many people have been very concerned about in the last decade or more, is that maybe we lack some of the vaccine development capacity that we need. And so I know there's a lot of work to try to develop that capacity now. Typically, when you're developing a vaccine, you might wait until you've got a vaccine that works before you start building the manufacturing facilities to develop that vaccine. In this case, we might want to start developing those manufacturing facilities today, even though we don't know precisely what vaccine we're making. You might want to start, putting the shovels in the ground and start building those facilities today, so that if and when a vaccine becomes available, I mean, hopefully soon, then your manufacturing facility be ready to hit the ground and go and start pumping out as many doses as possible.
So David, is there anything else that you feel that people who are trying to learn about COVID-19 and about vaccine development that would be helpful for them to understand?
I mean, it is a complex process. Again, there are kind of several phases of clinical trials that are going on. Phase one to see is this vaccine kind of safe. Phase two, see if it's also continue to monitor safety, but also try to figure out the right dosage and save. And phase three, looking for efficacy of the vaccine and also looking for more side effects. And so if you're keeping track of the news, I mean, keep track of what vaccines are in different stages of the pipeline. And usually there's a big funnel of a lot of drugs that come into state phase one, then fewer in phase two, then fewer in phase three. Keep an eye on that if you're concerned about when a vaccine might be available, and also realize that even if the vaccine does get FDA approval at the end of that phase 3, it's not a guarantee that you're going to be able to go to the local pharmacy the next week and pick one up. It oftentimes there is a period of time that it takes to actually manufacture a large number of doses, and again, there are going to be billions of people across the planet who are going to want this vaccine. I'm guessing that there are likely going to be governments that prioritize certain groups to get the vaccine first. So, yeah, keep all those things in mind. It's encouraging to see some vaccines, seeing some promising results in like phase 2 trials right now. But we have to be prepared that it might take a while. And again, even if a vaccine reaches FDA approval within a year, that doesn't mean you'll be able to step into your local pharmacy and actually pick one up. It still might be several months beyond that the vaccine actually becomes more widely available to a large number of people in the population.
Great. Well, thank you very much, David. It's been a pleasure chatting with you today about this very important topic.
Thank you for having me.